Welcome back. This is a talk on overpopulation globally in the context of climate change. You may have been in groups like I have where we're talking about climate change and somebody says, yeah, but we've got so many people, no matter what we do, we're not going to be able to get on top of this. So we're going to talk about overpopulation today, and we will just see if maybe we can't put a little bit of a different spin on what we have all been assuming. So I'm calling it the population conundrum, and we might as well start here with looking at exactly how many people there are. 7.7 billion as of October 2019. We can see in this graph that goes from 1750 to 2010 that it was pretty much steady growth until about 1950, and then population really just took off. Now the OECD countries, that's the developed world, maintained that sort of steady growth, but in the BRICS, these are emerging national economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they took off. A bunch of others, this would be including sub-Saharan Africa and probably South America, they really took off. So definitely some reason to be concerned. Now, YouTube wouldn't let me put any videos embedded in my talk, so we are going to just I'm going to talk about the videos, but there's a really awesome TED Talk by Hans Rosling that I recommend you go take a look at. It's called Global Population Box by Box. Rosling is a Swedish physician and statistician, but his real gift is to be able to take these big numbers and represent them to us in a way that's pretty visually easy to understand. So what he did was he went to IKEA and he got a bunch of these plastic boxes. Each box represents 1 billion people. And he shows us that in 1960, there were 3 billion people in the world. Now, 1 billion was in the developed world. And developed world is characterized by a population that is healthy, it's educated, and it's well off. Their aspiration in 1960 was to buy a car. 2 billion people in the poorest countries, and their aspiration was just to buy a pair of shoes. There was really quite a big disparity. Now, that had changed by 2010. We still have 1 billion people in the developed world, but their aspiration now is to go on an international vacation. We've got some emerging economies. These people are healthy, educated, and they're increasing in their wealth. So 1 billion of them is where we were in the 1960s. Their aspiration is to buy a car, but 3 billion have got enough wealth to aspire to have a bicycle, and we've still got the 2 billion in the poorest countries just wanting to buy a pair of shoes. Now, he does this quite awesome thing. This graph moves. I can't show you that, but the colors are over here. So red is, and the size. So we've got a big red dot here, that's for China. We've got a little bit red dot here, that's for Australia. You can kind of see the sub-Saharan African countries, there's a bunch of them, so they're all kind of little dots. North and South America, this shows yellow and this actually looks kind of green, but you can kind of get where we're at. This is probably the United States. We've got Canada, the South American countries. Here's Europe. You can see most of Europe is clustered down here. So let's take a look at what this graph is. This is a graph comparing children per woman up to 8 and whether they survive or not during childhood. So 100% survival, nobody's there, but looks like a lot of countries, Europe, Australia, probably the US here, into the 90 to 100% rate. Well, we're looking at maybe only 70% child survival here, but where we had Europe, and Europe is in maybe the 2 or 3 kids per, and Australia 2 or 3 kids per family. The US a little bit bigger. I know my family in 1960 was already 5 kids. we've got a lot of countries up here where the child survival rate is not very good, and the size of their families is quite frankly huge. And then by the time we get to 2008, you can see that everything is headed this direction. As healthcare improves, as child survival increases, the size of the families goes way down. We've still got these poorest 2 billion with big families. A lot of their kids don't survive, but everybody else, the number of kids in the family has really decreased as the number of kids that survive increases. In fact, global fertility rates, you can see it here. 1955, there was 1.5 kids per couple. By 2017, that had gone down to 1.10. Now, that is not replacement rate. So if everybody was at 110, we would see population on Earth begin to shrink. Now, what he projects is that by 2050, with renewable energy generation, electric cars, etc., and the right investments, we can move everybody into better lives without that big carbon footprint we all had when we were making the shift. When we were pulling our people out of poverty, we had all the coal and oil and natural gas we wanted to burn. What he says is that by 2050, the expectation is the developed world will still have 1 billion. China will donate another 1 billion people to that healthy, educated, well-off group who aspire to have an international vacation. We will have 3 billion people with an aspiration of buying a car. And again, with the right investments and the right policy, we can move these 2 billion poorest people into the developing world that aspire to buy a bicycle. And as we do that, the population rate will begin to fall because these people will quit having such large families because more of them will survive. So current birth rate is less than replacement rate among all countries where infants survive. High infant mortality rates come with high poverty rates. As people emerge from poverty, their birth rates just naturally decline. So bringing people out of poverty, which reduces the infant death rate, is actually the best way we can reduce population. And it's happening. Now, I just want to take a little closer look at population in general, especially for these people. Between the ages of 15 and 65, this is our working group of people, and a lot, frankly, falls on their shoulders. They've got kids of their own for a big chunk of that period in their life, and at some stage, they may be taking care of, or they probably are in one form or another, taking care of the aging population. So when we look at them, an easy way, probably the best way, is to look at what's called a population pyramid. These are available for every country and over time. So this one's in the US. What we can see is the age group goes up the side, and in this case, it's 4 years for every one of these horizontal lines. Now, population periods are divided male and female, and you can tell some things about a population. Males tend to die off earlier than females, and we see that here in the 80 to 85 and beyond, definitely more females. We can see that there's some big kind of outliers. There's a big bulge in the population here, and sure enough, that's the baby boomers and their children. And we can also see that for about the last 20 years, population growth in the United States is beginning to slow down. There is a contraction here with the smallest, the youngest people. Just kind of worth mentioning, you can see quite a bit of a country's history by looking at their population pyramid. Here, this is Germany's now looking, and they've got 95 as their oldest. But you can see there is a real difference between men and women. This was a deficit because of casualties in World War I. Then there was a decline in birth rates during World War I, so a bit of a dip in there. This is difference between men and women here is because men died in World War II. Decline in birth rates in World War II, and then both sides, the post World War II baby boom, and then like we're showing only even more distinct, there's a long-term fertility decline. That's Germany. We can look at change over time too. So in 1950, this is what the population looked like in the United States. 35% were 15 or under, and only 5% were 65 or older. So this big group in here taking care of both ends was 60%. Trying to take care of 40%, probably doable. And most of them were their kids, so by 2010, that had changed a lot. We looked at that population. Population pyramid. Now this group is only 13%, but holy smokes, this group has gone from 5% to 23%. This group's gone up a little bit. So maybe still doable, but what happens when you get to 2050, the projection, when 40% of your people are above the retirement age? So now you've got 52% of the people trying to take care of their own kids and this enormous aging population. That's starting to be a worry. China's got the exact same look. In 1950, 2015, 2050, you can see that there is a growing problem. Here's Japan and Denmark. Both of these, well, this was 2019 and this is 2017, but you can see the trend. Big group of people moving toward the top and a very small group of people coming in to replace them. This has not gone unnoticed. This was July 15th, 2020, fertility rate. This is BBC News, jaw-dropping global crash in children being born. Bloomberg a month ago said America's fertility rate needs a policy boost. Insurance Journal, the next global economic threat is an aging population. So the population, overpopulation globally is not so much about the babies being born, it's about the fact that we're living so much longer, so there's so much more of us older folks. Now, Denmark, this is a cute commercial called Do It for Denmark. This is put out by a Danish travel agency. And the basic idea is there aren't enough children being born in Denmark. Remember, we saw their population pyramid to support the aging population. And then, of course, this travel agency, so they happen to notice that 10% of all Danish children are conceived on holidays. So they're suggesting that if you go on an international holiday to help the falling Danish birth rate, you're going to have a good time. And just as a little incentive, if you can prove that you conceived a child, you could win a 3-year supply of baby stuff and a child-friendly holiday. So one of their key takeaway from that is developed countries are experiencing a real problem caused by low birth rates. Too few babies are born to support our aging population. So we saw that pyramid, the change over time and the direction it's headed. But here is another population pyramid that shows another way we might solve this problem. The United Arab Emirates in 2011, their population pyramid looked like this. Remember, this is female and this is male, and holy smokes, working age males, they have a ton of them. Now, they don't have quite the problem that we have, but they certainly have come up with a solution. What they've done is they have issued a bunch of guest worker visas. So men of working age and some women of working age can move into the area, work for a while, and then go home. So they come and go, come and go. We used to have that in the United States, a guest worker program. We'd get a lot of Mexican labor in particular come in to work the jobs that a lot of people didn't want to do, landscaping, working in agriculture. We stopped that, and it had made problems for both Mexico and the US. But UAE, it looks like it could work. Now, I'm just going to kind of arm wave here a bit, but you've seen this before. We talked about the Oxfam 2014 extreme carbon inequality. And what they discovered is that only 10% of the world's population, the richest 10%, is responsible for 49% of the emissions. Now, we are declining this, us rich folks globally in comparison, have a declining population. If we're not willing to import workers, the only thing we can do about that is to have more babies. These babies will continue to use, to emit a huge amount of carbon emissions. The UAE has suggested that if we invite guest workers who are probably from one of these low emission demographic groups or income groups, that actually it would be better for the planet than us just having a whole lot more kids. These people might use, they might emit a few more while they're in the United States, but maybe not. They probably don't have the lavish lifestyles that a growing child would. So again, key takeaways: the people in developed countries are responsible for much higher CO2 emissions than people in poverty situations. Increasing the population by increasing the birth rate in rich countries increases CO2 emissions, and by increasing the number of worker visas, we could support older folks and improve lives by bringing more people out of poverty without necessarily increasing the CO2 emissions so much. Now, this is a lovely little, just a heartbreaking little video from UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency. This was in 2019. Again, YouTube wouldn't let me show you the video, but you can go Google it, okay? Voices, faces, these are not numbers, but souls in flight. 70.8 million people currently are displaced worldwide. At the end of 2018, 2.3 million more were forcibly displaced. It's the highest number the UN Refugee Agency has seen. 25.9 million refugees have crossed borders to find safety, but 41 million are internally displaced. They've left their home, but they're someplace within country. And their children. Half of all refugees are children. A stunning 111,000 children are forced to survive alone because they have lost their parents. Refugees are disproportionately hosted not by the wealthy nations of the West, but by the poor and middle income countries that are right next to their own. Even as the numbers of refugees and asylum seekers increase, the opportunities to find them a permanent home in another country are diminishing. If you've seen the rise in nationalism that has said, keep them out, keep them out. 1.4 million people needed to be resettled in 2018, but only 92,000 in fact were. Now, this little video ends on kind of a positive spin. Governments are engaging, individuals, companies, and NGOs are taking part. They are trying to figure out how to best welcome these people who bring skills and experiences into other countries. They suggest, the UNHCR suggests, we've got to act together. Our solidarity across societies will power change and promote solutions to this enormous problem of displacement and give refugees a chance to aspire to a better future. Pope Francis has a little video telling us exactly what we should be doing. He said our first obligation is to welcome them. Make them feel welcome. Bring them into our societies. It's our obligation to protect them, both to protect them as they are trying to enter our shores and to protect them from the violence that sometimes follows with this backlash by nationalism. Our obligation is to promote them, help to educate their children, help to find them a way to fit into society, in fact, to integrate them into society. It's a two-way process. They need to help, we need to help. This can make us all a better, this can make both our own countries and these people who are displaced give them a better life. So we talked before about the trend in drought conditions. The trend in drought conditions tells us that Mexico, Central America, parts of South America, this big stretch across Southern Europe and the Middle East, and some of these places that are just going to be too wet are going to become places that are actually uninhabitable. We talked also about the heat index, the combination of heat and humidity. Because of the carbon emissions that largely the United States per capita is emitting, these people are being driven from their homes. We have an obligation. Here's where I talk about per capita, and you can see this is per person emissions. The US pretty much leads the way. People like to point their finger at China, but their per capita emissions is not that big. Yes, they do put out a lot of emissions, but they have a huge population, and quite frankly, a lot of their factories are making stuff that's bought by people in the United States. So it's hard for us to evade responsibility. Now, the beginning slide, I called this a conundrum. I called it a population dilemma, a population conundrum. So what a conundrum or a moral dilemma is, now this is moral. You have many choices and aren't sure which one is right. This is not a situation in which you're choosing between what's right and what's easier or pleasurable. That's a battle of personal will. You're going to have a drink with dinner. That's not a moral conundrum. The actual question is difficult to answer. Should you lie about cheating on your spouse? That is not a moral conundrum. That's actually right or wrong, okay? But possibly a moral conundrum. Should you lie so that your spouse feels better about the way he or she looks after they just got a haircut that you can't do anything about now for a while anyway? It could be a moral conundrum. There's also something called a practical conundrum. It's not a question of what's right in a moral sense, but what's right in a practical sense. So dilemma can either be a practical or a moral conundrum. So just some key takeaways. The people in developed countries are responsible for much higher CO2 emissions than people in poverty situations. We pulled our people out of poverty using fossil fuels, which now we're asking everybody to stop using. And the emissions are currently causing the problem, that are currently causing the problem, were mostly emitted by us. That's what's up there. But they are making places on Earth uninhabitable. And those places are generally places where people are kind of poor anyway. So they're impacting poor countries vastly more than they're impacting us. The longer we wait to act to reduce carbon emissions from the burning of fossil fuels, this already serious problem will get exponentially worse. It's not too late. What can we do? So I hope you have a nice discussion. And we've just got one more week to go. And the next week, what you'll be doing is actually talking about in your group, what can we do? We got a very short little video clip for you to end it with. But we have kind of high hopes that a few people will watch this series. Thank you.